We've been going through the Practical Christianity, which is the 6th, this will be the 10th part we've had on it. If you remember, we're turning trials into triumphs, was basically we all have trials. In chapter 1, you have handling temptation. We all have temptations in chapter 1. And then we're also told to quit kidding, deceiving ourselves, that it's easy to be a hearer of the word only and not be a doer, and you get caught up with that. Partiality is very real in everyone's life. And we have to address partiality as a church as well as individuals. Then you have genuine faith. You can have dead faith. You could have demonic faith, or you can have dynamic faith, where you really, it affects all areas of your life: intellect, emotions, and will. The world's smallest but yet the largest troublemaker, our tongue. And basically, the tongue can direct, it can destroy, and it can delight. And we make the choice as to what it's going to do. And then also, we were talking about true wisdom, the origin of wisdom, and the outcome, and whether it's coming from the world or whether it's coming from our sin nature or whether it's coming from the Lord. And remember last week we saw true conflict and solutions, and we all can have trouble with conflict with each other. We can have conflict with ourselves, and we can also have conflict with God. And basically it's telling us to submit to Him, draw near to Him by becoming like Him, and then humbling ourselves before Him. So that kind of gives us up to date to where we're at. And so today we're looking at James 4, 13 to 17. But if you remember, a couple of years ago, Dalton Hill Baptist Church decided to put together a vision team, and the desire was to kind of have a plan for the church, what we were going to do. And so the team came up with a 1-year goal, a 3-year goal, a 5-year goal on different things. If you remember, one of them behind us was part of what we said, that part of it we believe what our goal is that of restoring, and you know, so many people are hurting and they've dropped out of church, trying to heal them and restore them, and then basically get them back into ministry. It's also what you have here on the side, what different people are saying, what the church has done for them and how they are thankful for the church and with getting them back. So these are just constant visual reminders of what we need to be doing. So it's easy for us to look at it, but I think it's interesting when you think about it. We talk about planning for the future. How many of you, if you knew that COVID was going to hit, would have planned differently? Do you think some of you could have made money a little bit better? Some of you might have saved a little differently? Things happen like that in our lives where you can plan, but I think it's important to recognize what part does God have in our plans. And so it's interesting, he's now going to talk about it because it's very, very easy for us not to have God in our plans. So if we just review a little bit from last week, how many of you ever have done it or had other people do it for you, is playing God in somebody else's life? And we do that a lot as you get older without really thinking about it. When I was your age, I did it this way. Well, how is our, in a sense, are we not playing God in somebody's life? Let's look at it in chapter 4, notice in verse 11. Playing God with others, this is just kind of a review. Notice our choice. Do not speak against one another, brethren. He who speaks against a brother or judges his brother speaks against the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law, but rather a judge of it. There's only one lawmaker and judge, the one who is able to save and destroy. But who are you to judge your neighbor? Notice in our choice, our attitude and our actions. We choose our attitude, we choose our actions. Am I going to be a judge, or am I going to be a doer? And a lot of times we want to judge. You notice the challenge is to allow God to judge. I always think God needs help. God needs help, and I'm the perfect one to do it, right? I'll let Him do eternity, and I'll do today, right? And we are all very capable of doing that as we think. But the problem you have it is in 1 Corinthians 4 and verse 5, is we don't know the motive. And we don't know what's going on behind the scenes. And how is you ever judge somebody and judge them totally wrong when you find out the truth, you feel like a real heel. So it's important. So notice then we have a choice, the challenge, and obviously the chore is, our chore is not to judge, but be a doer. As soon as we become a judge, we will quite often stop being a doer. And don't worry about what everybody else is doing. We just do what we need to do. Be a doer of the word. And I think a lot of us like to get sidetracked going. As a teacher, did students ever want to sidetrack you? It is especially true when I taught. I'll never forget. All right, if we cover this much material, we'll have a test on Friday. Oh man, it was amazing how many questions I got. oh boy, they wanted to sidetrack you like mad. And of course, you knew what they were doing, and then whether it was a legitimate question, sometimes you would intentionally be allowed to postpone the test, but most of the time, they were just doing it trying to get you sidetracked. Satan does the same thing, and we do. We get sidetracked so easily. So I think it's interesting, just playing God with others. You know, we can ask ourselves, have we done it this week? If I've done it this week, what am I going to do about it today? Okay, am I going to go confess? Am I going to go tell the person, hey, I was wrong to do that? Hey, Lord, I was wrong to do that. Help me to change my ways. Because I think what happens is just second nature so often we don't even recognize it. I think it's important so often we know we're doing it, but we don't stop. Playing God with others. But notice, I think the second part, when you look at it, starting in verse 13, is playing God with ourselves, or planning for the future. And the reminder, I think you remember in Ephesians 5, Paul is writing, and remember he says, make the most of the time, for the days are evil. So we need to plan. There's nothing wrong with planning, but how many of us are including God in our plans? In Proverbs 6, verse 6 down to 11, it says you need to be like the ant, you sluggard. Well, what does the ant do? Does the ant store up things? Yes. He does all this work, and he's storing up. And I think so we can learn, there's nothing wrong with planning, but what happens is when we don't include God in our plans. So he's wanting to write, and James is, to the believers. And so I think when verse 13 and 14, you're going to find out, what about the ignorant of God's word, or God's will, rather. Ignorant of God's will. Now, he's given them the benefit of the doubt. He'll address the disobedience here in a minute, but ignorant of God's will. And notice the evidence is verse 13. Notice he says, come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we shall go to such and such a city, spend a year there, engage in business, and make a profit. Notice then the ignorance that you have. Who chooses the time and the schedule? Well, in the passage, who did?
We do.
Who chose the location? Who chose the length of stay? Who chose the purpose? Who chose the outcome? Yeah. How many times do we do that too? Notice then, he's given the benefit of the doubt. They're ignorant of God's will. Maybe maybe the young believers, maybe they don't know. They're just doing all this. But how many of us have done the same thing? I remember when I went to the refinery and they hired me, my plan was to be there 10 years. The reason I want to be there for 10 years is when you were, at that time in Sunoco owned the refinery, if you worked 10 years, you could then go and do any job you wanted, leave, retire, whatever, and they would then, you could keep your insurance. Just pay the same as the person who's working there. And you could go do whatever job you wanted. Well, that was my plan. I thought then after when I was 55, I'd go into ministry or do whatever, and I'd have insurance. Well, when I was 53, the refinery sold. So much for my great plan, right? Then the Holly said, you got to go 5 years. So I go 5 years, and then they said, well, you can retire, but you have to pay the Korver price. No. Well, notice that's why I'm still there. So notice then, you can make a lot of plans, but ultimately, what's God's plan? But think about it. Choosing the time and schedule, choosing the location, the length of stay, the purpose was personal profit, and then also the outcome was profit, and then also to boast. Look what I did. And I think we all can very easily get caught up in this being ignorant of God's will. Notice the evaluation in verse 14. You do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. Do you agree with that? So in other words, you're ignorant about tomorrow. Remember in Proverbs 27:1, it says, boast not about tomorrow, you do not know what today brings. And a lot of you have had different things. You're feeling great, you go to bed, the next day you wake up, and what happens? You can't get out of bed, you're hurt, you're whatever it might be. You have all these plans that you're ignorant about what even tomorrow brings, let alone next week. Thus, the second part, he says there, you are just a vapor that appears for a while and then vanishes away. You're ignorant about how long you're going to live. How many of you have ever made the statement, I've heard it many times by older people, if I knew I was going to live this long, I would have
taken better care of myself.
Ignorant of the length of life. You don't know. So noticing here, you're making all these plans, but you don't know what tomorrow brings. You don't know how long you're going to live. So we need to include God in our plans. Because what happens if you decide to do all these things and you're only here for a couple of days and you're gone? Notice then in all of the evaluation, let's think of some examples stuff about the ignorant of God's will. If you remember in the book of Joshua, we go back through it. If you remember, it's interesting when you look at it. What was the very first city that they went to attack?
Yeah.
No, Ai wasn't the first one. What was the first one?
Jericho.
Jericho. Now it's interesting when you look at God's plan. If you were doing it, would you have them attack a major city? No. If this is your first battle, which one are you going to choose?
Easy.
An easy one. You'll notice also what they did in God's plan was they went right through the center and then they went to the different directions. Why would it not be wise militarily to go through a center of a country? Because you're going to have enemies on what? But that was God's plan. Also, it doesn't make sense to go march around the city once every day for 6 days. What's that going to do to the morale of the people? And what's that going to do to the people inside the city? Is that going to kind of encourage them? But they did that, and obviously we know the story. They followed God's plan exactly the first time. But in Joshua 7, they now come up to Ai. And you think about Joshua 7, if you remember in verse 3, what did they say? The men went and spied it out. You remember in verse 2. In verse 3, they said, we don't need to send everybody and trouble everybody because it's such a small city. Let's just send 3,000 people and we can easily take the city. How many of us get caught up in self-reliance? Hey, we don't need God's help. We don't need God's plan. We can do just fine with ours. Also, the main root was because of Achan, the sin of Achan and his family. There's sin in our life, and consequently, we're self-reliant, there's sin in our life, and we're not trusting God, and we no longer have Him on our side. And obviously, Ai defeated him. When they confessed the sin, and they then did what God told them to do in attacking the city, they had success. So just the example of Ai, self-reliance gets us into a lot of trouble. I don't need God. Basically, what happens is after we've done it all ourselves and we mess it up, kind of like Carrie Underwood when she sings the song, Jesus, Take the Wheel. How many of us do that? We're doing just, everything's falling apart. We've been running our own life and we're on ice and we're skidding off the road, and then what do? Jesus, take the wheel. He takes the wheel, and as soon as we get to the side of the road and it's now stopped, what do? Move over. I'm taking back over. So I think it's interesting, the self-reliance and sin in the camp. But you think about it, you go a little bit later in Joshua chapter 9, what about with the Gibeonites? When they come, what did they do? They made themselves look like they traveled many, many miles, which they were just a neighbor, and made them look like all this stuff is bolted and everything had fallen apart. It's interesting when you get to verse 14, it says, Joshua and the leaders did not consult God. They relied strictly on what? Their own senses, their sight. Hey, I can see they've gone along with it. No, they didn't, but that's what they thought. How many of us make decisions strictly based on our own sight, our own senses? I know how to run this. I know how to do this. And we don't ever think about God, about whether we do it. What happens when He can do that in anything. What about purchasing a vehicle? I know how to look at a vehicle. I know how to make judgments about mechanical things. I don't need to ask God whether it's a good one or not. Whether it's the right one for our family or not. I can do it. It's interesting then what happens then you notice they made a covenant in verse 15 and they had to stick with their word for the rest of the time. They had to be men of their word and they blew it. So you think about it, self-reliance got them in trouble. Sin in the camp got them in trouble. Walking by sight, not by faith, got them in trouble. What about Luke 14? Let's look at that one. It's well known, but look over in Luke 14 for a moment. I said 14. I meant 12. Luke 12. If you remember, he's giving a parable in verse 16 about a certain rich man. And the certain rich man notices what happens. He has a bumper crop in 16, and he says, notice, begins reasoning with himself, what shall I do since I have no place to store my crops? He said, this is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns, build larger ones, and there I'll store all my grain and all my goods. And I'll say to my soul, you have many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. Well, what's he doing? He's short-sighted, is he not? He's living for the line and living for the dot, not living for the line. He didn't think about eternity. You notice it's in how it was then required. Notice what it says. But God says, you fool, this very night your soul is required of you, and now who will own what you prepared? Notice 21. So the man who lays up treasures for himself is not rich towards God. How many of us are rich towards God? An interesting statement. Are we living for the line? Or are we living for the dot? So you notice what you have here is, I think it's interesting, you have the ignorance of God's will. We can easily do it, get caught up in it, maybe being self-reliant, short-sighted, walking by sight, and so on. The question you can ask then on the being ignorant, do I include God in my plans or simply ask for His blessing? Am I the pilot and He's the passenger? And I think in reality there's a lot more truth to that than we'd like to admit. So think about it, the ignorance. Notice then you jump down to verse 17 back in James. In James chapter 4 and verse 17. Notice it says, therefore, to the one who knows the right thing to do and doesn't do it, to him it is sin. Okay, so if maybe they were ignorant, but then also maybe they know what God's will is and doesn't do it. Disobeying God's word. I think it's interesting. Notice he comes right out and says it's sin. 1 John 3 and verse 4 says sin is breaking into God's laws or standards. When we know what to do and we don't do it, it's sin. Let's call it exactly what it is. Second thing I think it's interesting in Hebrews, which you don't have to necessarily turn there, but Hebrews chapter 12, remember verse 5 to 11, what does God as a father do to those of us who are disobedient? He disciplines. He spanks. And there can be different degrees of spanking. And so what happens is I think sometimes he is very long-suffering. You see that with Nebuchadnezzar. He gave Nebuchadnezzar an entire year, but he did spank him, did he? So I think it's interesting. So notice when we disobey God's word, it is sin. And the second thing, we're asking for a spanking. The third thing I think is interesting is the severity that you have. In Luke 12, later in the text when we were reading earlier, it says, if you know His will and don't do it, you receive many lashes. If you don't know His will and don't do it, it's not as many lashes. Spank. So when as a believer, the more and more I know and I refuse to do it, I'm asking for what? Those of you who have siblings, how many of you love being the older one? Did the spanking ever get sometimes a little more severe because you knew better? You led the little ones astray? And so I think it's important. The same thing is true with God too. When we know what we're supposed to be doing as a believer and we don't, it's different than one who didn't know and messed up. So I think it's interesting, the severity. So also I think it's interesting when you think about it, it's sobering. What about in Hebrews 10 and verse 31 when it says it's a terrifying thing to fall into the hands of what?
Angry.
Okay. That's true. We disobey and we do things. Look at the children of Israel. He let them go a long time, but boy, they got some severe spankings. Our nation's certainly going to get one. I don't know when, but it's going to get one. So whether it's in my lifetime or not, I don't know. But that same is true in my life. The spanking is coming if I do not correct what's going on. So think about the disobeying. So you think about the Corinthians. Remember we read it all the time in 1 Corinthians 11 when we do the Lord's Supper. Well, what does it say in verse 30? For this reason many of you are weak, are sick, and a number of you are dead, have died. God punishes. Now they can blame it on, they can say, well, they died of this, they died of that, and we can have whatever the different things. Well, God can just as easily have brought those into that person's life. We can say what we like. But I think it's important to recognize when we disobey God, we are asking for punishment. The severity is up to Him, but He will come. And so I think it's important to recognize. So we can be ignorant of God's Word. We can also be disobedient of His Word. I think an interesting one would be, am I doing what God wants me to do? We have a lot of things He tells us what to do. And I never forget a professor telling me 45 years ago, I'm not worried as much about what I don't understand about the Bible. I'm more concerned about what the Bible tells me and I'm not doing. And there's a lot of truth to that. Am I under His discipline? And if I am I changing my ways? If I'm not, the spanking is going to what? It's going to get a little more severe. You know, ever happened with you growing up? You got one and you did it again. Was the second one a little bit tougher than the first one? You know? Another thing to think about, if I am disobeying, and I have for a while, and I've never been disciplined by the Lord, disobeying, am I really a believer? And I think that's important to really, that's a question you really have to ask. And that's what I recognized with Gene's brother. We thought he had asked Christ, but it's very obvious that he had not, and sure enough, today he will say that he never had. But we thought he had many, many years ago. And so, you know, we may think so, but if there's never discipline in a person's life, and they continually going against the Lord, then I just simply was wrong. They never. Judas is a good example. The disciples thought he was a believer, but he never was, according to John. So I think it's interesting to ask those questions. Notice in the last one, obviously, is what about obeying God's will? Notice in verse 15. Notice what it says. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live and also do this or that. Who should be our pilot? The Lord. Who should be our planner? The Lord. Well, what about the plan? You think about the plan, what does He want me to do? Now, I think you look at it, there's so many direct commands that you have in Scripture. That's the plan. According to 2 Corinthians 5, you remember, He has given us the ministry of reconciliation. People say, I don't know what God wants me to do. Well, just start opening your Bible and reading. I mean, there's 54 commands just in this book alone. We read 10 of them last week. I mean, it's not hard to look at it to see what it says. Ministry of reconciliation, also told we're supposed to be ambassadors. Well, if we're supposed to be an ambassador for Christ, who are we supposed to be representing? And what message are we supposed to be giving? So when He says go into all the world and preach the gospel, well, then what are we supposed to be doing? I mean, the plan is there. We don't have to ask ourselves, what do I need to do? I have a God big enough that when I do what He tells me to do, He'll tell me the next step. But it's interesting, what about with Abraham? Did Abraham know all that was going to happen, or was he just go one step at a time? Leave Ur. Different steps. Most of us want what? We want it all laid out, and then we're going to decide what? If I'm going to do it or not. And how many of us say, I don't want to do God's will, He's going to send me off to some terrible place in the world. That's a pretty poor view of God. And also, what's the safest place to be? In God's will or out of God's will? Interesting question. But I think about it. Look over in Romans chapter 1. It's interesting. If you remember, why had Paul, you think about it, was Paul the apostle to the Gentiles?
Yes.
If he's an apostle to the Gentiles, then why has he never been to Rome if Rome is the capital of the Gentile world? If you remember, he said earlier that he didn't want to build on any foundation where somebody else had started. So now his plan is to come to Rome. Notice what he says in verse 10. Always in my prayer making request, if perhaps now at last, by the will of God, I may succeed in coming to you. You get to 15, he was planning on going to Spain. And he was going to come by way of Rome and be refreshed by them and be helped sent on his way then to Spain. Did that ever happen? According to Scripture that we have recorded, that never happened. God had other plans. You know, You think about it, going to imprisonment was not Paul's plan, but it was God's plan. Why did God put him in prison?
Write the letters.
Look at all the letters he wrote because of it. A lot of times God puts us in prison, but our ministry doesn't stop. It may just simply change. And the long-lasting effects of the ministry could arguably be that Paul's ministry is greater today than it was then. We don't know. And so I think it's important to notice that the plan was there. What did Jesus say in Luke 22:42? When he's at the Garden of Gethsemane, remember he's praying. He says, Lord, take this cup from me, but not what? My will, but thine be done. How many of you are glad that God didn't go ahead and grant that? Where would you and I be today if God said, okay, you don't have to go to the cross? The perfect sacrifice never would have occurred, and we would still be in our sin with no hope. So I think it's important to recognize. You think about it, what about with Joseph? Do you think Joseph wanted to go all the way down to Egypt? Why did God send him down there ahead of time?
Spare many lives.
To spare many lives and save the nation of Israel. It's a whole lot bigger than just simply our life. But think about it. What about so you have he should be our pilot. He should be our planner. We have a plan. The Word of God tells us what to do. But what about your perspective? You think about Matthew 5, verse 33. Seek ye first what? And then all these things will be added unto you. 34, don't worry about tomorrow. Each day has enough what? Troubles. And how many of us are worried about tomorrow? I think about, you have it all the time. People are constantly talking about retirement. I've been talking to a guy at work today, or last week, about retirement. And when I talked to one, he says, we have enough money to live till you're 73. According to when you look around, do I have a history of living a little longer than 73? I'm in trouble. But I think about who do you need to be trusted? So when do you retire? When God tells you to retire. And what do? You do what God tells you to do. If He tells you to keep working there, you keep working there. If He tells you to leave, you leave. And so I think it's important. Keeping the perspective, you think about with Moses in Hebrews 11, you remember it says he gave up the riches of Egypt. Was that worth anything? Okay, well look at King Tut's stuff, right? Because it says in verse 26 of Hebrews 11, he was looking for his eternal reward. How many of us get so caught up in today that we don't look at the eternal reward? And what happens is it comes and goes. So happy about getting a house 20 years ago. It's in desperate need of being redone. You just never get done. Time you finish it, and all needs to be changed. What about in Colossians 3? Remember, he's talking in verse 24. He says, do you work heartily as unto the Lord? And then in verse 24 it says, you will receive an inheritance. Because what happens when you're doing your work unto the Lord, you often will not get very much here. People will not notice the good job you're doing here. Your boss may not notice the good job. You may not get rewarded for the great job you're doing here. But your eternal reward, you will. In Paul's last letter, when he writes in 2 Timothy, he says, I've entrusted him with what I've done. Eternal reward. I've given it to him. You look in 1 Thessalonians, Paul in chapter 2, he says, when he stands before the Lord, he says, what have you done with your life? He said, I want to turn to the Thessalonians and said, you are my crown, my exaltation. What do I have to show for my life? I have these people to show and what I've done in their life. That's what I have to show. So I think it's important when you're looking at it, obeying God. So think about some questions then when you look at it. Let's think about these questions. First one, have I played God in somebody else's life? I have to be real careful. When people ever ask you, what do you think I should do? Be real careful on how you answer that. Because you're playing, have you prayed about it? And be careful when you answer that question. Because if you haven't, you could be giving them very, very poor advice. Not godly advice. But think about it, am I playing it? I think another question you can ask ourselves is, do I include God in my plans? Or is he simply a passenger in the vehicle that's out of control? Am I doing what God wants me to do? Notice it's not the results. The results are in God's hand. We're simply to cast the seed, we're simply to water, plant, and so on. And then obviously the last one, do I trust God with my eternal things? Is the Lord my pilot and my planner? Am I following the plan? Is my perspective the line or the dot? At work, they say it all the time. Know the plan and work the plan. Do you know the plan? Then how many of us are working the plan? Think about it. Think about it.